Kings of the Angevin Empire. So I hope you enjoyed watching parts 1 through 4, where I talked about the journey, the birth of a name, the family pedigree and the Norman conquest, and in the last episode, Kings in the Royal Gallery. Today we're talking about part 5, Kings of the Angevin Empire. You were likely shocked to see, as I was, of the fantastic ancestry in the Dubé heritage. As I said before, you may hail from the Dubés or the Dubucs, Lauzon, Morin, or Couture families, but we all have some unique and some incredible ancestry. In this final episode, I'm going to be sharing stories about King Henry III of England and Queen Isabella of Angevin, King John of England, King Henry II of England and France, Geoffrey V of Plantagenet, who was the Count of Anjou, Fulk, King of Jerusalem, Fulk IV, Count of Anjou, Geoffrey II, Count of Gatineau, Hugues de Perche, followed up by Fulkrich, Count of Mortagne-au-Perche. So let's get started and talk about the royal lineage and the Dubé name. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to start with my grandparents, Roger and Beatrice Dubé. And his parents were Emile and Amelia Dubé, the first great-grandparents, where the Dubé name started. Louis Etienne and Yvonne de Buc were my second great-grandparents. Then Louis de Buc, born 1836 to 1914, was my third great-grandfather. Followed by my fourth great-grandfather, Julien de Buc, 1788 to 1859. Followed by Marie-Therese Bordelot, 1746 to 1823, my fifth great-grandmother. And then my sixth great-grandmother, Geneviève Dion-Guillon, 1717, her death is unknown. Followed by Pierre Dion, 1674 to 1737. My eighth great-grandfather was Jacques Dion-Guillon, 1849 to 1708. Gabrielle Roger, 1620 to, and it's unknown, it was our ninth great-grandmother. René Roger, born 1576 to 1633, is my 10th great-grandfather. And his father was Gervais Roger, 1557 to 1640, was my 11th great-grandfather. Now this is where we get into Knights of the Garter, where we start with Sir Richard Rogers II, my 12th great-grandfather, born 1528 to 1605, who was preceded by Sir John Rogers, born 1498 to 1565, our 13th great-grandfather, followed by or preceded by Lady Elizabeth Catherine de Courtenay, a 14th great-grandmother, born 1480 to 1518, who was preceded by Sir William de Courtenay, 1428 to 1485, my 15th great-grandfather, who was preceded by Sir Philip de Courtenay of Mulland, born 1404 to 1463, my 16th great-grandfather, who was preceded by Sir John de Courtenay, born 1382 to 1406, and was my 17th great-grandfather, who was preceded by Sir Philip de Courtenay of Powderham. His birth date was unknown, but he died in 1406. He was my 18th great-grandfather, and whose mother was, and preceded by Lady Margaret de Bohun, born 1311 to 1391, my 19th great-grandmother, and she was the connection to the royalty that I discovered when her mother, who I discovered, was Elizabeth de Rhuddlan of Plantagenet, born 1282 to 1316, and was my 20th great-grandmother, who was the daughter of King Edward I of England, born 1239 to 1307, and my 21st great-grandfather, and this is the beginning of the Angevin period. King Henry III, my 22nd great-grandfather, born 1st of October 1207, died 16th of November 1272. Henry III of England, also known as Henry of Winchester, was King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Duke of Aquitaine from 1216 until his death. He was the son of King John and Isabella of Aquitaine. Henry assumed the throne when he was only 9 in the middle of the First Barons' War. Cardinal Guala declared the war against the rebel barons to be a religious crusade, and Henry's forces led by William Marshal defeated the rebels at the battles of Lincoln and Sandwich in 1217. Henry promised to abide by the Greater Charter of 1225, which limited royal power and protected the rights of the major barons. His early rule was dominated first by Hubert de Burgh and then Peter de Roche, who re-established royal authority after the war. In 1230, the king attempted to reconquer the provinces of France that had once belonged to his father, but the invasion was a debacle. A revolt led by William Marshal's son, Richard, broke out in 1232, ending in a peace settlement negotiated by the church. Following the revolt, Henry ruled England personally rather than governing through senior ministers. He traveled less than previous monarchs, investing heavily in a handful of his favorite palaces and castles. He married Eleanor of Provence, with whom he had 5 children. Henry was known for his piety, holding lavish religious ceremonies and giving generously to charities. The king was particularly devoted to the figure of Edward of the Confessor, whom he adopted as his patron saint. He extracted huge sums of money from the Jews in England, ultimately crippling their ability to do business, and as attitudes towards the Jews hardened, he introduced the Statute of Jewry, attempting to segregate the community. In a fresh attempt to reclaim his family's lands in France, he invaded Poitou in 1242, leading to the disastrous Battle of Tallembourg. After this, Henry relied on diplomacy, cultivating an alliance with Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor. Henry supported his brother Richard in his bid to become King of the Romans in 1256, but was unable to place his own son Edmund on the throne of Sicily, despite investing large amounts of money. He planned to go on a crusade to the Levant, but was prevented from doing so by rebellions in Gascony. By 1258, Henry's rule was increasingly unpopular, the result of a failure of his expensive foreign policies and the notoriety of his Poitevin half-brothers, the Lusignans, as well as the role of his local officials in collecting taxes and debts. A coalition of barons, initially probably backed by Eleanor, seized power in a coup d'etat to expel the Poitevins from England, reforming the royal government through a process called the Provisions of Oxford. Henry the baronial government enacted a peace with France in 1259, under which Henry gave up his rights to his other lands in France in return for King Louis IX recognizing him as the rightful ruler of Gascony. The baronial regime collapsed, but Henry was unable to reform a stable government, and instability across England continued. In 1263, one of the more radical barons, Simon de Montfort, seized power, resulting in a second Barons' War. Henry persuaded Louis to support his cause and mobilized an army. The Battle of Luz occurred in 1264, where Henry was defeated and taken prisoner. Henry's eldest son, Edward, escaped from captivity to defeat de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham the following year and freed his father. Henry initially enacted a harsh revenge on the remaining rebels, but was persuaded by the church to mollify his policies through the dictum of Kenilworth. Reconstruction was slow, and Henry had to acquiesce to various measures, including further suppression of the Jews, to maintain baronial and popular support. Henry died in 1272, leaving Edward as his successor. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, which was rebuilt in the second half of his reign, and was moved to his current tomb in 1290. Some miracles were declared after his death, however, he was not canonized. Edward, his son, became the Duke by Dozen's 21st great-grandfather while married to Eleanor of Castile. They had 8 children together. In this picture you see the effigy of King Henry III, which is in Westminster Abbey. Isabella of Angulem, 23rd great-grandmother, born 1186, died June 4th, 1246. Isabella of Angulem was Queen Consort of England as the second wife of King John from 1200 until John's death in 1216. She was also Countess of Angulem from 1202 until 1246. Isabella had 5 children by the king, including his heir, later King Henry III. In 1220, Isabella married Hugh X of
Lusignan, Count of La Marche, by whom she had another 9 children. Isabella was the only daughter and heir of Elmer Taillefer, Count of Angevin, by Alice of Courtenay, who was sister of Peter II of Courtenay, Latin Emperor of Constantinople, and granddaughter of King Louis VI of France. Isabella became the Countess of Angevin in her own right on 16th of June 1202, by which time she was already Queen of England. Her marriage to King John took place on the 24th of August 1200 AD in Angevin, a year after he annulled his first marriage to Isabel of Gloucester. She was crowned queen in an elaborate ceremony on the 8th of October at Westminster Abbey in London, England. Isabella was originally betrothed to Hugh IX Lebrun, Count of Lusignan, son of the Count of La Marche. As a result of John's temerity in taking her as his second wife, King Philip II of France confiscated all of their French lands, and armed conflict ensued. At the time of her marriage to John, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Isabella was already renowned by some of her beauty and has sometimes been called the Helen of the Middle Ages by historians. Isabella was much younger than her husband and possessed a volatile temper like his own. King John was infuriated with his young, beautiful wife. However, his acquisition of her had at least as much to do with splitting his enemies as romantic love. She was already engaged to Hugh IX Lebrun when she was taken by John. It was said that he neglected his state of affairs to spend time with Isabella, often remaining in bed with her until noon. However, these were rumors spread by John's enemies to discredit him as a weak and grossly irresponsible ruler. Given that at the time John was engaging in a desperate war against King Philip of France to hold on to the remaining Plantagenet duchies. The common people began to term her as a siren or Messalina, which spoke volumes as to the popular opinion. Her mother-in-law, Eleanor of Aquitaine, readily accepted her as John's wife. On October 4th, 1207, at the Winchester Castle, Isabella gave birth to a son and heir named Henry III, after the king's father, Henry II. He was quickly followed by another son, Richard, and 3 daughters, Joan, Isabella, and Eleanor. All 5 children survived into adulthood and made illustrious marriages. All but Joan produced offspring of their own. Henry III became the Dubé-Dozen's 22nd great-grandfather. Described by some contemporaries as vain, capricious, and troublesome, Isabella could not reconcile herself with her less prominent position in France. Though the Queen Mother of England, Isabella was now mostly regarded as a mere Countess of La Marche, and had to give precedence to other women. In 1241, when Isabella and Hugh were summoned to the French court to swear fealty to King Louis IX of France's brother Alphonse, who had been invested as Count of Poitou, their mother, the Queen Dowager Blanche, openly snubbed her. This so infuriated Isabella, who had a deep-seated hatred of Blanche for having fervently supported the French invasion of England during the First Barons' War in May 1216, that she began to actively conspire against King Louis. Isabella and her husband, along with other disgruntled nobles, including her son-in-law Raymond VII of Toulouse, sought to create an English-backed confederacy which united the provinces of the south and west against the French king. She encouraged her son Henry in his invasion of Normandy in 1230, but then did not provide him the support he had promised. In 1244, after the confederacy had failed and Hugh had made peace with King Louis, the 2 royal cooks were arrested for attempting to poison the king. Upon questioning, they confessed to have been in Isabella's pay. Before Isabella could be taken into custody, she fled to Fontfrevraud Abbey, where she died on the 4th of June, 1246. By Isabella's own prior arrangement, she was first buried at the abbey's churchyard as an act of repentance for her many misdeeds. On a visit to Fontfrevraud, her son King Henry III of England was shocked to find her buried outside the abbey and ordered her immediately moved inside. She was finally placed beside King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Afterwards, most of her Lusignan children, having few prospects in France, set sail for England and the court of Henry, their half-brother. The next is King John of England, the 23rd great-grandfather, born 24th of December 1166 and died 19th of October 1216. John, also known as John Lackland, was King of England from 1199 until his death in 1216. John was the Duchy of Normandy and most of his other French lands to King Philip II of France, resulting in the collapse of the Angevin Empire and contributing to the subsequent growth and power of the French Capetin dynasty during the 13th century. The baronial revolt at the end of John's reign led to the sealing of Magna Carta, a document sometimes considered an early step in the evolution of the Constitution of the United Kingdom. John, the youngest of 5 sons of King Henry II of England and Duchess Eleanor of Aquitaine, was at first not expected to inherit significant lands. Following the failed rebellion of his elder brothers between 1173 and 1174, however, John became Henry's favorite child. He was appointed the Lord of Ireland in 1177 and given lands in England and on the continent. John's elder brothers William, Henry, and Geoffrey died young. By the time Richard I became king in 1189, John was a potential heir to the throne. John unsuccessfully attempted a rebellion against Richard's royal administrators, whilst his brother was participating in the Third Crusade. Despite this, after Richard died in 1199, John was proclaimed King of England and came to an agreement with Philip II of France to recognize John's possession of the continental Angevin lands at the peace treaty of Le Gaulet in 1200. When war with France broke out again in 1202, John achieved early victories, but shortages of military resources and his treatment of Norman, Breton, and Anjou nobles resulted in the collapse of his empire in northern France in 1204. John spent much of the next decade attempting to regain these lands, raising huge revenues, reforming his armed forces, and rebuilding continental alliances. John's judicial reforms had a lasting effect on the English common law system, as well as providing an additional source of revenue. An argument with Pope Innocent III led to John's excommunication in 1209. A dispute finally settled by the king in 1213, John's attempt to defeat Philip in 1214 failed due to the French victory over John's allies at the Battle of Boivin. When he returned to England, John faced a rebellion of many of his barons, who were unhappy with his fiscal policies and his treatment of many of England's most powerful nobles. Although both John and the barons agreed to the Magna Carta peace treaty in 1215, neither side complied with its conditions. Civil war broke out shortly afterwards, with the barons aided by Louis of France. It soon descended into a stalemate. John died of dysentery, contracted whilst on campaign in eastern England during late 1216. Supporters of his son Henry III went on to achieve victory over Louis and the rebellion barons the following year. Contemporary chroniclers were most critical of John's performance as king, and his reign has since been the subject of significant debate and periodic revisions by historians from the 16th century onwards. Historian Jim Bradbury has surmised the current historical opinion of John's positive qualities, observing that John is today's usually considered a hard-working administrator, an able man, and an able general. Nonetheless, the modern historians agree that he also had many faults as king, including what historian Ralph Turner described as distasteful, even dangerous personality traits, such as pettiness, spitefulness, and cruelty. These negative qualities provided extensive material for fiction writers in the Victorian era, and John remains a recurring character within Western popular culture, primarily as a villain in films and stories depicting the Robin Hood legends. King John married Isabella of Angoulême. They had 5 children together. Their eldest, Henry III, would become the Doobie Dozen's 22nd great-grandfather. King John of England was preceded by King Henry II of England and France, the 24th great-grandfather of the Doobie Dozen, born the 5th of March 1133, died the 6th of July 1189. Henry II, also known as Henry Courmantel, or in French, Courmanteau, Henry Fitz-Empress, or Henry Plantagenet, ruled as King of England, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, Maine, and Nantes, and Lord of Ireland. At various times he also partially controlled Scotland, Wales, and the Duchy of Brittany. Before he was 40, he controlled England, large parts of Wales, the eastern half of Ireland, and the western half of France, an area that would later come to be called the Angevin Empire, reflecting the dynasties of three kings, Henry II and his two sons, Richard and John. Henry was the son of Geoffrey of Anjou and Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England. He became actively involved by the age of 14 in his mother's efforts to claim the throne of England, then occupied by Stephen of Blois, and was made Duke of Normandy at 17. He inherited Anjou in 1151 and shortly afterwards became the Duke of Aquitaine by marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose marriage to Louis VII of France was recently had been annulled. Stephen agreed to a peace treaty after Henry's military expedition to England in 1153, and Henry inherited the kingdom on Stephen's death a year later. Henry was an energetic and sometimes ruthless ruler, driven by a desire to restore the lands and privileges of his grandfather, Henry I. During the early years of his reign, the younger Henry restored the royal administrations in England, re-established hegemony over Wales, and gained full control over his lands in Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. Henry's desire to reform the relationship with the church led to conflict with his former friend Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This controversy lasted for much of the 1160s and resulted in Becket's murder in 1170. Henry soon came into conflict with Louis VII, and the two rulers fought what has been termed a Cold War over several decades. Henry expanded his empire, and often at Louis's exposure, taking Brittany and pushing east into central France and south into Toulouse. Despite numerous peace references and treaties, no lasting agreement was reached. Henry and Eleanor had 8 children, 3 daughters and 5 sons. 3 of his sons would be king, though Henry the young king was named his father's co-ruler after than a standalone king. As the sons grew up, tensions over the future inheritance of the empire began to emerge. Encouraged by Louis and his son King Philip II, in 1173 Henry's heir apparent, young Henry, rebelled in protest. He was joined by his brothers Richard, later a king, and Geoffrey, and by their mother, Eleanor. France, Scotland, Brittany, Flanders, and Boulogne allied themselves with the rebels. The Great Revolt was only defeated by Henry's vigorous military action and talented local commanders, many of them new men appointed for their loyalty and administrative skills. Young Henry and Geoffrey revolted again in 1183, resulting in the young Henry's death. The Norman invasion of Ireland provided lands for his youngest son John, later a king, but Henry struggled to find ways to satisfy all his sons' desires for land and imminent power. By 1189, young Henry and Geoffrey were dead, and Philip successfully played on Richard's fears that Henry II would make John a king, leading to a final rebellion, decisively defeated by Philip and Richard. Suffering from a bleeding ulcer, Henry retreated to Chenot Castle in Anjou. He died soon afterwards and was succeeded by Richard. After Richard's death in 1199, John became king. Henry's empire quickly collapsed during the reign of his son John, but many of the changes Henry introduced during his long rule had long-term consequences. Henry's legal changes are generally considered to have laid the basis for the English common law, while his invention in Brittany, Wales, and Scotland shaped the development of their societies and governmental systems. King Henry II's youngest son John would become the Dubé-Dozen's 23rd great-grandfather. King Henry II was preceded by Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, the Dubé-Dozen's 25th great-grandfather, born the 24th of August 1113 and died the 7th of September 1151. Geoffrey V, called the Handsome or the Fair, in French Le Bel, and Plantagenet, was the Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine by inheritance from 1129, and then Duke of Normandy by conquest from 1144. His marriage to Empress Matilda, daughter and heiress of Henry I of England, Geoffrey had a son, Henry Kermantle, our 24th great-grandfather, who succeeded to the English throne as Henry II. from 1154 to 1189 and was the first of the Plantagenet dynasty to rule England. The name Plantagenet was taken from Geoffrey's epithet. His ancestral domain of Anjou gave rise to the name of Angevin for three kings of England, Henry II, his son and heir, and Henry's sons Richard and John, and what would become known as the Angevin Empire in the 12th century. Geoffrey was the elder son of Fulk V of Anjou and the Armagard of Maine. Geoffrey received his nickname from the yellow sprig of broom blossom, Genet as the French name for the Platana genista or broom shrub. He swore in his hat. Geoffrey was described by the chronicler John of Miromortier as handsome, red-haired, jovial, and a great warrior. King Henry I of England, having heard good reports of Geoffrey's talents and prowess, sent him royal legates to Anjou to negotiate a marriage between Geoffrey and his own daughter, Empress Matilda. Consent was obtained from both parties, and on June 10, 1128, the 15-year-old Geoffrey was knighted in Rouen by King Henry in a preparation for the wedding. Geoffrey and Matilda's marriage took place in 1128. The marriage was meant to seal a peace between England, Normandy, and Anjou. She was 11 years younger than Geoffrey and very proud of her status as empress. As opposed to becoming a mere countess, their marriage was a stormy one with frequent long separations, but she bore him 3 sons and survived him. Their eldest son, Henry II, would become the Dubé-Dozen's 24th great-grandfather. The year after the marriage, Geoffrey's father left for Jerusalem, where he was to become king, leaving Geoffrey behind as Count of Anjou. In 1139, Matilda landed in England with 140 knights, where she was besieged at Arundel, castle by King Stephen. In the anarchy which ensued, Stephen was captured at Lincoln in February 1141 and imprisoned at Bristol. A legatine council of the English Church held at Winchester in April 1141 declared Stephen deposed and proclaimed Matilda Lady of the English. During 1142 and 1143, Geoffrey secured all of Normandy west and south of Seine, and on the 14th of January 1144, he crossed the Seine and entered Rouen. He assumed the title of Duke of Normandy in the summer of 1144. In 1144, he founded an Augustine priory at Château Le Hermitage in Anjou. Geoffrey held the duchy until 1149, when he and Matilda conjointly ceded it to their son, Henry. With secession was formally ratified by King Louis VII of France the following year. Geoffrey also put down 3 baronial rebellions in Anjou in 1129, 1135, and 1145 to 1151. He was often at odds with his younger brother, Elias, whom he had imprisoned until Elias died in 1151. The threat of a rebellion slowed his progress in Normandy, and is one reason he could not intervene in England. Geoffrey died later the same year, aged just 38, and Henry took his father's place as head of the Plantagenet house. In 1153, the Treaty of Wallingford stipulated that Stephen should remain King of England for life, and that Henry, the son of Geoffrey and Matilda, should succeed him, beginning the Plantagenet era in England. Northwest France, 1150. Geoffrey died suddenly on the 7th of September, 1151. According to John of Miromortier, Geoffrey was returning from a royal council when he was stricken with fever. He arrived at Château de Loire, collapsed on a couch, made bequests of gifts and charity as he died. His wife and sons outlived him. He was buried at the St. Julian's Cathedral in Le Mans, France, and Henry succeeded him as Duke of Normandy. And this is an enamel effigy of Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, from his tomb at Le Mans. His decorated shield suggests early origins of 3 lions of the Royal Arms of England. His father was Fulk, King of Jerusalem, the Dubé-Dozen's 26th great-grandfather. Fulk, also known as Fulk the Younger, was the Count of Anjou, as Fulk V from 1109 to 1129 and the King of Jerusalem from 1131 to his death. During his reign, the Kingdom of Jerusalem reached its largest territorial extent. Fulk was born at Angers between 1089 and 1092, the son of Count Fulk IV of Anjou and Bertrand de Montfort. In 1092, Bertrand deserted her husband and bigamously married King Philip I of France. He became Count of Anjou upon his death in 1109, and the next year he married Ermengarde of Maine, cementing Angevin control over the county of Maine. Fulk was originally an opponent of King Henry I of England and a supporter of King Louis VI of France, but in 1118, or maybe 1119, he had allied with Henry when he arranged for his daughter Matilda to marry Henry's son and heir, William Adelin. Fulk went on crusade in 1119 or 1120 and became attached to the Knights Templar. He returned late in 1129, after which he began to subsidize the Templars, maintaining 2 knights in the Holy Land for a year. Much later, Henry arranged for his daughter Matilda to marry Fulk's son, Geoffrey of Anjou, which she died in 1127 or 1128. By 1127, Fulk was preparing to return to Anjou when he received an embassy from King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Baldwin II had no male heirs, but had already designated his daughter Millicent to succeed him. Baldwin II wanted to safeguard his daughter's inheritance by marrying her to a powerful lord. Fulk was a wealthy crusader, an experienced military commander, and a widower. His experience in the field would prove invaluable in a frontier state always in the grip of war. However, Fulk held out for the better terms than mere consort of the Queen. He wanted to be king alongside Millicent. Baldwin II, reflecting on Fulk's fortune and military exploits, acquiesced. Fulk abdicated his county seat of Anjou to his son Geoffrey V and left for Jerusalem, where he married Millicent on the 2nd of June 1129. Later, Baldwin II bolstered Millicent's position in the kingdom by making her sole guardian of his son by Fulk, Baldwin III, born in 1130. Fulk and Millicent became joint rulers of Jerusalem in 1131 with Baldwin II's death. From the start, Fulk assumed sole control of the government, excluding Millicent altogether. He favored fellow countrymen from Anjou to the native nobility. The other Crusaders, states to the north, feared that Fulk would attempt to impose the suzerainty of Jerusalem over them, as Baldwin II had done, but as Fulk was far less powerful than his deceased father-in-law. The northern states rejected his authority. Millicent's sister Alice of Antioch, exiled from the Principality of Baldwin II, took control of Antioch once more after the death of her father. She allied with Pont de Tripoli and Jocelyn II of Edessa to prevent Fulk from marching north in 1132. Fulk and Pont fought in a brief battle before peace was made, and Alice was exiled again. In Jerusalem as well, Fulk was resented by the second generation of Jerusalem Christians, who he had grown up there since the First Crusade. These natives focused on Millicent's cousin, the popular Hugh II of Le Poisson, Count of Jaffa, who was devoted loyally to the Queen. Fulk saw Hugh as a rival, and it did not help matters when Hugh's own stepson accused him of disloyalty. In 1134, in order to expose Hugh, Fulk accused him of infidelity with Millicent. Hugh rebelled in protest, and Hugh secured himself to Jaffa and allied himself with the Muslims of Ascalon. He was able to defeat the army set against him by Fulk, but the situation could not hold. The patriarch interceded in the conflict, perhaps at the behest of Millicent. Fulk agreed to peace, and Hugh was exiled from the kingdom for 3 years, a lenient sentence. However, an assassination attempt was made against Hugh. Fulk or his supporters were commonly believed responsible, though direct proof never surfaced. The scandal was all that was needed for the Queen's party to take over the government in what amounted to a palace coup. Author and historian Bernard Hamilton wrote that Fulk's reporters went in terror of their lives in the palace. Contemporary author historian William of Thierry wrote of Fulk, he never attempted to take the initiative, even in trivial matters, without Millicent's consent. The result was that Millicent held direct and unquestioned control over the government from 1136 onwards. Sometime before 1136, Fulk reconciled with his wife and a second son, Almeric was born. Geoffrey V of Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, Fulk's first son, became the Duby-Dozen's 25th great-grandfather. Fulk IV was born 1043, died 14th of April 1109. Sometimes called Le Rachin, was the Count of Anjou from 1068 until his death. The nickname by which he is usually referred to has no certain translation. Philologists have made numerous very different suggestions, including quarreler, rude, sullen, surly, and heroic. He was noted to be a man with many reprehensible, even scandalous habits by Ordic Vitalis. Fulk, born 1043, was the younger son of Geoffrey II, Count of Gâtinais, sometimes known as Aubry, and Ermengarde of Anjou. Ermengarde was a daughter of Fulk the Black, Count of Anjou, and the sister of Geoffrey Martel, who preceded Fulk and his brother Geoffrey as Count of Anjou. When Geoffrey Martel died without direct heirs, he left Anjou to his nephew, Geoffrey III of Anjou, Fulk Le Rachin's older brother. Fulk fought with his brother, whose rule was deemed incompetent, and captured him in 1067. Under pressure from the church, he released Geoffrey. The two brothers soon fell to fighting again, and the next year Geoffrey was again imprisoned by Fulk, this time for good. Substantial territory was lost to Angevin control due to the difficulties resulting from Geoffrey's poor rule and the subsequent civil war. Saintonage was lost, and Fulk had to give the Gâtinais to Philip I of France to placate the king. Much of Fulk's rule was devoted to regaining control over the Angevin baronage and to a complex struggle with Normandy for influence in Maine and Brittany. He died in 1109, leaving the restoration of the countship, as it was under Geoffrey Martel, to his successors. Fulk may have married as many as 5 times. There is some doubt regarding the exact number of how many he repudiated. His first wife was Hildegard of Beaugency. Together they had a daughter. Ermengarde married Alan IV, Duke of Brittany. After her death, before or after 1070, he married Ermengarde de Bourbon. Together they had a son before Fulk repudiated her in 1075. Geoffrey IV Martel ruled jointly with him for some time, but died in 1106. Around 1076, he had married Orengarde de Chatillon. He repudiated her in 1080, possibly on the same grounds. He then married an unnamed daughter of Walter I of Brienne by 1080. This marriage also ended in divorce in 1087. Lastly, in 1089, he married Bertrand de Montfort, who was apparently abducted by King Philip I of France in or around 1092. They had a son, Fulk V, Le Jeune, a.k.a. Fulk the Younger, Count of Anjou and King of Jerusalem. Geoffrey II, Count of Gâtinais. Geoffrey II de Château-Landon was the Count of Gâtinais. He was the son of Hugues de Perche, Count of Gâtinais, by Patrice de Mâcon, the daughter of Aubry II de Mâcon. About 1035, he married Ermengarde of Anjou, Duchess of Burgundy, daughter of Fulk III and Count of Anjou. After Geoffrey's death, she married Robert I, Duke of Burgundy. Together, Geoffrey and Ermengarde had 3 sons. Hildegard de Château-Landon married about 1060 to Jocelyn I, Lord of Courtenay. His famous son was Jocelyn I, Count of Edessa, by a different wife. Geoffrey III was the next born, 1040 to 1096, followed by Fulk IV, born 1043, died 1109, who became the Duby-Dozen's 27th great-grandfather. This image was found in the public domain, so we're not exactly sure whereabouts or when it was created or where it hangs. Hugues de Perche, 29th great-grandfather, born 970 AD, died 1020 AD. Hugues de Perche was the 10th century French noble. He was the youngest son of Foulques, the Count of Perche, probably of the family of Viscounts from Châteaudun, and his wife Melisande, daughter of Hugues I, Viscount of Châteaudun, and granddaughter to her 32nd great-great-grandfather Geoffrey I, Viscount of Châteaudun. He was also one of the first known ancestors in the male line of the Plantagenets. he married Beatrice de Mâcon, the widow of Geoffrey I, Count of Gâtinais. She was the daughter of Alibert Aubray II de Mâcon, Comte de Mâcon. 2 children were born from this marriage. Geoffrey II, Count of Gâtinais, he was known by his nickname Ferrol, which stands or means ironwood, by his marriage with Ermengarde Blanche of Anjou. Geoffrey II became the Dubé-Dozen's 28th great-grandfather. His descendants would not only become Count of Anjou, but King of Jerusalem and England as well. And the next born was Lutin, Lord of Ivry, from 1028 to 1050. In the charter that his stepson Aubray, Count of Gâtinais and Fracon, Bishop of Paris, signed May 26, 1028, he is quoted as a witness, along with his 2 sons Geoffrey and Laton. It is this act that evidenced the second marriage of Hugues de Perche with Beatrice. Being from a vassal family of the Counts of Blois, while the Counts of Gâtinais were faithful to the Capitan kings of France, the marriage took place probably during a period of rapprochement between the 2 families. During the marriage of King Robert II, the Poix, and Bertha of Burgundy, widow of Eudes I of Blois, between 996 and 1003. So very little is known about Hugues de Perche, and this is an image we found also in the public domain. Next we have Fulquich, Count of Mortagne au Perche, the Dubé-Dozen's 30th great-grandfather, born about 950 AD and died 1031 AD. Fulquich, or Fulqua, Count of Mortagne, son of Rotrou, Seigneur de Nogent. It has been conjectured that Fulquich or Fulqua answer was Hervé I, Lord of Mortagne au Perche, through Hildegarde de Mortagne de Perche, daughter of Hervé I, wife of Rotrou. Fulqua married Melisande, the Viscountess of Châteaudun, daughter of Hugues, Viscount of Châteaudun, and Hildegarde, Viscountess of Châteaudun. Fulqua and Melisande had 2 children. Fulqua was presumably succeeded as count by his son Geoffrey. Geoffrey, Viscount of Châteaudun and Count of Perche. Hugues de Perche, the next born, became the Dubé-Dozen's 29th great-grandfather. Now this image that I have here is one that I found online in the public domain, and it pretty much represents what a person of this period would look like. It's not actually a picture of Fulqua, but I put it in here to give a bit of a representation as to what he may have looked like. So I hope you enjoyed this series. And that wraps up the ancestral relationships between the Dubé name and the Dubé-Dozen's ancestry, going all the way back through time, through royalty. I hope you enjoyed this 5-part series, and you pass it along. For those who are family members that are watching it, I hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, I hope you pass it along to other family members and let them have a chance to see our heritage. And for those who are just watching, I hope you enjoyed the series and found it interesting. I found it fantastic. I enjoyed discovering my family and my roots and my heritage.